Hello there. Do you ever get this really oppressive feeling when you're walking through a museum and all the objects just feel really dead somehow, as though they've been taken out of the cycle of history and are merely being preserved, like, I don't know, a jar of pickled cucumbers? They just don't have any agency anymore. I get this especially with religious art, which was once commissioned for religious settings. Christian art, I find, really comes into its own when it's being surrounded by choir boys singing in Latin, burning candles, incense, and whispers of prayer. You get none of that in museums, just white walls. Today, I want to introduce you to a fascinating painting, which is still, thankfully, located in its original context, a church in Germany. It has been hailed as, and I quote, the single most important visual monument of German Reformation. It's the first work on my list of 100 paintings that I would rescue from a burning building, although that's going to be pretty tough because it's a huge painting and the doors of the church are very small, but I suppose we've got to try. Let me first explain why this is the exact right moment to celebrate this specific painting. This month, 500 years ago, the September Bible was published, arguably the most consequential book event in modern European history. A priest and theologian, Martin Luther, had translated the New Testament to German. This was a huge deal. Instead of publishing yet another learned Latin version, which would only be accessible to a small educated elite, he wanted to reach the whole German folk. There was, however, one major problem. There was no single German language, just a series of dialects. You had Upper German, which was spoken primarily in southern Germany, and you had Low German dialects, which were spoken mainly in northern Germany. They were very different. Fortunately, Luther was bilingual. As a child, his parents had taken him to live in various places, and as a result, he knew both Upper and Low German really well. To make himself clear to the whole nation, he deliberately blended all these dialects together like a proper nice German vegetable stew. What's more, he would go out to the marketplace and listen to ordinary people speaking, picking up little words and phrases here and there, and then recycle them in his Bible translation. Because he wrote in a way that everyone could understand, he brought the Bible to life for ordinary Germans in a way that had never been done before. The propagandist within me admires this very much. Writing a vernacular Bible was a clever thing to do and revolutionary. Using the printing press, which, remember, had only been invented in Germany some 80 years before by Gutenberg, he distributed the Bible with a great deal of success. The Luther Bible ran to 500,000 copies in his lifetime alone and was read by millions more. Luther disseminated his ideas not just using the printed word, but also through images. To this end, he weaponized the talent of his friend, the artist Lucas Cranach. They really were good buddies. They were witnesses to each other's marriages, they were godfathers to each other's children. It's even very likely that Luther met his future wife, the runaway nun Katharina von Bora, at Cranach's house. Catherine was an intriguing woman. She was intelligent, she wanted to be involved in the growing reform movement, and she was fed up, I think, with celibacy. So she secretly fled from her cloister. She had nowhere to stay, but Lucas Cranach and his wife Barbara took her in, and she lived with them in Wittenberg for several years. It seems that Luther met her there. She told Luther's friend and fellow reformer, Nikolaus von Amsdorf, that she did not intend to marry, but if she did marry, and I quote, "It will have to be either you, my dear von Amsdorf, or Martin Luther. Nothing else will do." So in a way she really proposed to him, which I think is quite progressive for the time. Cranach painted Lucas in all his different guises and truly made him the icon of the Reformation. If you go to the Cranach Digital Archive, I've put a link down below, and you type in Luther, you'll find that there are 380 registered paintings by Cranach which are in some way or other associated with Luther. Cranach the Elder first produced a print of Luther as an Augustinian monk in 1520, looking fresh-faced, if maybe a little austere. Not everyone could afford to buy a painting, but woodblock prints were cheaper, so this was great. He then depicted Luther as the academic, wearing his formidable doctor's hat. When Luther's life was in danger, because he had been excommunicated by the Pope and declared an outlaw by Emperor Charles V, he fled to Wartburg Castle and disguised himself as an aristocrat called Junker Jörg, or Lord George. Cranach portrays him without scholarly or ecclesiastical dress. Then we have the moving portraits of Luther and his wife, images of an ordinary couple suffused with a quiet dignity, designed to scotch Catholic rumours that Luther had married some kind of monstrous harlot. By the late 1520s, Luther had become the dignified church father, and his image at this stage served as the archetype for the portraits of other reformers, such as Philippe Melanchthon. Characteristically, they show their subjects wearing the biretta, a symbol of ecclesiastical authority. The older Luther was generally portrayed bareheaded, as a professor in plain academic dress enhanced by a fur collar. He painted Luther even on his deathbed. An image was disseminated as a print within days of Luther's death. Their friendship and collaboration culminated in one final tour de force, the Weimar Altarpiece, which stands in the Hedekirche. On the face of it, this might look like your typical Christian triptych, but nothing could be further from the truth. It's actually the most amazing thing. On the central panel, we see the crucifixion of Christ, but Lucas Cranach paints himself being present together with his friend Martin Luther. It's so strange and seemingly anachronistic. To make things even weirder, Christ's blood is gushing forth from his side wound, pouring on top of the artist's head. Why? Why? Luther literally points to the answer, a passage from his German translation of the Bible concerning Christ's redemptive blood, which is central to Luther's doctrine of the so-called priesthood of all believers. In the course of the Middle Ages, a great divide had come to exist between, on the one hand, the spiritual elite, a hierarchy of priests who were allegedly closer to God, and on the other hand, mere temporal Christians, the laity, normal, ordinary, common people like you and me. Luther thought this divide between Christians was preposterous, that there was no foundation for it to be found in the Bible, and so he posited that no priest was needed to stand between the common man and God. Indeed, that in the eyes of God, all Christians, that's those who are baptized and have faith in Christ, are priests. This notion has since been adopted by all Protestant denominations. The original intended audience of this altarpiece, the people of 16th century Weimar, would have known Lucas Cranach. They would have seen him on the street or through the windows of his house at the marketplace as he was busily working on a painting. By placing himself at the foot of the cross, the artist creates a bridge between what happened 1500 years ago for him and his own day. The artist is a stand-in for every man. Just like he's being saved, You will be saved if only you have faith in Christ. It really doesn't get more personal than this. In quite a sophisticated way, Cranach uses repetition to emphasize God's grace and the importance of faith. In the background, the Old Testament tale of Moses and the brazen serpent plays out. I'll tell you what happened in a nutshell. God sent a plague of serpents to punish the Jews for their lack of faith. However, he gave Moses instructions, and I quote, "Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live." It is on the face of it an absurd proposition. God is asking the Israelites to focus their gaze on a sculpture of the very thing that will kill them if they look away. It's of course a test. He's testing their faith in him. And they are saved. This emblem of a cross with a redeeming figure foreshadows the crucifixion of Christ, which similarly brings redemption to humankind. This sacrifice goes beyond the power of the brazen serpent. It's much more profound. It erases original sin itself, which, interestingly, it must be said, had also been brought about by a serpent. By juxtaposing these scenes from the Old and New Testament, Cranach highlights this message of keeping the faith, not in saints or worldly institutions, but directly in God. On the left, a man is throwing up his arms in horror and despair as he is being chased by a skeleton and a beast, wielding a club representing Satan and death, who force him, poor guy, into the fires of hell. It exemplifies the hopelessness of mankind. We know Christ as a meek prophet who said, "Do not resist the one who's evil," and "turn the other cheek," and "love your enemies." In paintings, he's often portrayed as weak and fragile. But on the left, we see the victorious Christ. Behind him, there's the burial cave and an open marble sarcophagus, which shows us that he's risen. And as a sign of his victory and resurrection, he wears the red robe, as opposed to a simple loincloth. He's triumphing over death and the devil, who now lie on the ground under his feet. He thrusts an almost transparent victory banner into the devil's throat. To be frank, I find this depiction of Jesus very refreshing. Now, who paid for this artwork? The altarpiece conveys the close ties between Luther and his protectors, the Dukes of Saxony. They're the ones who commissioned this altarpiece and are therefore represented as donors on the inner wings of the triptych. On the left panel, we see Elector Johann Friedrich der Großmütige, the Magnanimous, and his wife Sibylla of Cleves, the older sister of Anne of Cleves, whom you will know, or should know, as the fourth wife of King Henry VIII. Like his brother-in-law, Johann Friedrich was rather corpulent, to put it mildly, but he was also extremely well-read. He received his education from a close friend of Martin Luther, and thus became devoted to his teachings. He fought courageously to uphold the Reformation and its values, but was defeated by the Roman Catholic Emperor Charles V in 1547 at the Battle of Mühlberg, where he received a slashing wound to the left side of his face, leaving him with a permanent disfiguring scar from his lower eye socket all the way down his left cheek. Although such imperfections were usually made more flattering by artists, Cranach actually highlighted the scar as a sign of Johann Friedrich's courage and his willingness to suffer for his religious convictions. portrait prints by Cranach and Pankraz Kempf turned this scar into a stigma of the Christ-like passion Johann Friedrich endured when, stripped of his powers as imperial elector, he lived his final days in exile in Weimar. Of course, traditionally a Schmies or jeweling scar has been considered a badge of honor among upper-class Austrians and Germans who would engage in fencing or Mensur while at university. Because Mensur swords are wielded with one hand, and most fencers are right-handed, these scars are usually targeted to the left profile. Some famous examples of men who got this scar are the SS commander Heinz Reinefahrt, Kurt Debus, Otto Skorzeny, and the list goes on. I think they look pretty cool. Johann Friedrich set a good example. In all seriousness, we can learn something from the Elector. He was simultaneously a man who was receptive to learning and a genuine man of action who was prepared to put his own life on the line for what he believed was right. What's the takeaway of all this? This triptych celebrates not just the gigantic and historic event of the Reformation, but also a personal friendship. It was only completed after both Luther and Cranach had died. It was finished in 1555 by his son, also called Lucas Cranach. There is evidence to suggest he actually did most of the work, and that this was his homage to his late father. The famous writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the author of Faust, was a descendant of Cranach and lived in Weimar, so I imagine he would regularly attend service at the Hedderkirche, if only to pay tribute to the painting made by his ancestor. The painting is a celebration of Luther and his efforts in securing a correct translation of the Bible from the original Hebrew and Greek, which would eventually make German unification possible. After all, Luther was effectively responsible for creating the Hochsprache, Standard German, and for rallying German princes around the common cause of Protestantism. It is an optimistic image, one of hope and redemption and the gift of Jesus, in which evil gets vanquished and a sense of triumph dominates. In this time, when I see a lot of people falling into nihilism, I think we can all do with a little bit of faith, a little taste of victory, and that is ultimately the message of this painting. It is about the triumph over death and over evil. The story behind the painting is about the righteous individual taking on a corrupt elite and winning and triumphing. And that's a message that's always relevant. Next week, we'll discuss a different painting. Which one might that be? I'll give you a hint. It is, in a very literal sense, the elephant in the room.